Okay, so after that lesson, I did some experimenting with my tanks project, and unfortunately, I noticed a little bit of an issue when it comes to adding volume attenuation in this project. Now, as we know, this is an isometric game, meaning the camera sits kind of above and at an angle to the player, or players in this case. And that's also where the audio listener is attached to. It's attached to the camera, and every audio source calculates its volume attenuation based on the position of the audio listener. Because that's attached to the camera, it means that volume attenuation is calculated based on the camera's position, not the player's position, which it would be in most games, such as first-person games or third-person games, for example. Because of this, simply just moving the tanks further away from the oil rigs doesn't necessarily drop the volume of our sound, because the camera's not necessarily moving further enough away. Now, as you can see, what I've done is I've driven my two tanks into the top corner of my game, and I've paused it. What I'm going to do now is play the game. Obviously, you should expect to hear, well, nothing. You shouldn't hear the oil rig sounds. However, if we play the game, we quite clearly hear them, and that's despite the fact that I've added some volume attenuation to them, as you can see in the bottom right corner. Again, the reason why this is happening is because whilst the tanks are in this corner up here, and the oil rigs are over here, nice and far from them, the camera necessarily isn't far away. If I try and move the scene camera a little, you should be able to understand that the distance to the oil rigs and the camera is a lot different to the distance between the tanks and the oil rigs themselves. So we need a way to fix this little issue. Now, there are lots of ways we could do this, and if we wanted to, we could get really technical with C# and actually calculate the distance between the two tanks, or rather the center in between the two tanks and the oil rigs, because of course the two tanks aren't always going to be touching each other and so close like they are in our game. At some points they're going to be really far apart, and in those situations it would make more sense to calculate the distance between the oil rigs and the center position between these two tanks, as that would more or less give us the sense of a center between them to help us calculate where we should start attenuating our volume from. However, I think I found a nice and simple solution that actually works really well with the nature of how we're actually triggering these sounds, and that's by using the animation itself to trigger them. So before I explain my solution, let me quickly talk to you about meshes in Unity. Now, in case you don't know, everything you see in your game is made up of a mesh, essentially. So these oil rigs, the shape and the actual 3D model that we're looking at is made up of a mesh, basically a collection of triangles or polygons that makes up what we see on the screen. Now, in Unity, there are lots of different types of components called renderers that allow us to display and show these meshes to our viewer. In the same way that we looked at collider components, and there was loads of different types of collider components. There was sphere colliders and cube colliders, square colliders, etc., which all stemmed from a main class called a collider. There are loads of different types of rendering components. For example, this one used a skinned mesh renderer, and there's also other types of renderers. They all inherit their properties from a class called the renderer class. Now, that class actually has a property or a variable called isVisible, and what we can do is check this variable. What it will do is return us either a true or a false value whenever a given mesh is on screen or on any camera, because we can actually use more than one camera in Unity. So what we're going to do is check that variable and check to see whenever our oil rig is on camera and visible to the player. When it is, we'll play our sound, and when it's not, we'll tell it not to play. So I'm going to quickly end this game now, jump into my script that we looked at earlier, the PumpJack audio script, and see how we can use that variable to our advantage. The first thing we'll need is a public reference variable, and that reference type is going to be of the renderer class I was referring to. Then we can give this a name. I'm just going to call mine mesh. Then what we can do is come down to our if statement. Now, obviously, as we know, this if statement is checking to see if the play audio boolean that we created is true, and if it is, it's going to play our sound. Well, what we're also going to check for now is if the play audio variable is true and if the is visible variable that lives within the mesh, or rather the renderer class, is also true. If it is true, then we'll play our sound. So now both of these conditions have to be true for it to play. So if the mesh is not visible on our camera or any camera in our game, then we won't hear any sounds coming from our animation. And that is literally it. So all we need to do now is save and assign a mesh to our variable. Okay, so let's select one of our pump jacks in the hierarchy tab. Now remember, we're only playing sound from one of our pump jacks because playing them from all three was too much, and we chose which one we wanted to play it through using the play audio boolean, which we set to true. So whichever one you chose, select that game object and then come down to the mesh field that we've just created. This is where we need to assign a mesh to our variable. Now that mesh renderer component we just looked at isn't attached to the pump jack object, or rather the parent pump jack object. It's actually attached to the child pump jack object, as you can see. So what we need to do is go to our mesh variable and drag the child pump jack object into the field, just like that. And as you can see, it recognizes the mesh component attached to it. Now it doesn't actually have to be the child of the same object that you're using to play your sounds through. If you wanted to, and I think this is what I'm going to do, you could use one of the mesh components attached to one of the other pump jacks. So we know that there are 3 pump jacks in our scene. Now this one we're more likely to see first because our tanks start from these 2 spawn points, spawn point 1 and spawn point 2. So if they were to drive towards these oil rigs or pump jacks, they're most likely going to drive into this one first, and therefore the camera is going to see this one first. So what I want to do is find that one in particular. There it is, and I want to use this one's mesh renderer. So I'm going to go back to my first pump jack object, scroll down, and in the mesh field I'm going to actually drag the child pump jack object from my last pump jack parent object, I should say, number 2. So I'm going to click on that, drag it in and assign it. Now before we test our game, there's one more thing you should know. Like I said earlier, the is visible variable checks to see whenever any camera is looking at our pump jacks or whichever mesh we've decided. Now by any camera, that includes the camera that shows us the game through our scene tab. So in order to test this properly, it's very important that before you press play, you move your camera and make sure it isn't looking at our pump jacks. Once you've done that, hit play and let's see how this sounds. Okay, so the pump jacks are not on the screen, and because of that we can't hear them play. So that's already a good sign. Now let's see what happens if I drive the red tank over towards them. There we go, we hear them play. Now what's good about this little method is that we can also use this with our volume attenuation. So if I drive the blue tank closer and thus move the camera closer, we should hear the volume of them increase. And there we go, we do. Finally, I'm going to drive the tanks over to that corner and let's have a listen to see if we get the same issue. And there we go. So once the camera has moved off of the mesh and the current sound playing has finished, we no longer hear any more sounds. So there we go, that was just a quick little bonus lesson and an easy way for you to control and play your sounds only if they're on camera and visible to the player.